This is the story of two criminals and a community that lived in peril. The crimes wreaked havoc among gay men in New York City.
He's last seen alive in a bar,
but were hardly recognized by the public. And some say even authorities.
Investigators say Richard Rogers would pick up gay men, then murder them.
This is the story of a community that lived in fear.
He very well may have more victims.
But soldiered on to be who they are. And how two killers were eventually brought to justice. For Inside Edition Digital, I'm Sal Bono, and this is New York Gritty.
The 1970s was a sexual revolution for everybody, particularly gay men. This was after the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion, which defined the modern gay movement and sort of led to a lot more freedom and visibility. And it was before AIDS reared its ugly head in the early 80s. Sex was everywhere. For gay men, it was not only in bars, there was sex in trucks, sex on the pier. Sex was in the air, and people were certainly taking advantage of it.
In the late 1970s, one man committed a series of crimes that shocked New Yorkers in the gay community. Between 1975 and 1976, the dismembered bodies of 6 men turned up in the Hudson River. Cops believed all the men were gay. The bags that contained the remains reportedly had the insignia of NYU Medical Center's neuropsychiatric unit. The crimes became known as the bag murders.
These murders of LGBTQ people have just been kind of brushed aside for decades, and that there's dead ends and no evidence of any sort of attempt to bring justice for them.
Suspicion would eventually fall on a man named Paul Bateson.
Paul Bateson was a well-respected technician at the NYU radiology lab. He worked there in the early into mid-70s. All of his colleagues loved him. They said he had a great bedside manner. They said that he was great with patients.
Bateson, along with his co-worker, Dr. Barton Lane, appeared in the classic 1973 film, The Exorcist, in one of the movie's most memorable scenes.
Regan, I'm just going to move you down on the table, okay?
The people in it, except for the actors, were all professionals. So Paul was in it, of course, because he's the chief neurotechnologist. And we were all dedicated to making it as realistic a scene as possible. We had no idea whether the scene was going to be used or not. We had no idea really much about the movie.
It's just for a short time.
Well, I'm the one who gets to put the needle in her neck and say, don't move.
You're going to feel a little stick here. Don't move.
How did you know Paul Bateson?
So when you rotated through the radiology department, you worked with whoever the technologists assigned to you were. And although Paul wasn't the only neuroradiology technologist, but he's the one I remember the best because I learned a lot from him. He was very good at what he did. He knew more about technology side of neuroradiology than anybody. And that meant that he knew a lot of things that I needed to know. He had a good sense of humor, but he was never flippant. He was always focused on what he was doing, which I respected because that's what you sort of have to do. We didn't socialize, but we talked about things in common. We both liked the Metropolitan Opera and the New York City Opera, and we talked a bit about that. I would say he was calm and professional in the best sense.
In the mid-1970s, Bateson would reportedly frequent bars that were popular within the leather subculture, like the Anvil and Mine Shaft, which were after-hours clubs in downtown Manhattan. Many would keep secret that they attended such locations.
The Mine Shaft was part of a subculture within the community.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't like, oh, what'd you do this weekend? He wouldn't have said to his co-worker, I went to the Mine Shaft, you know. It was an after-hours club in the meat market, and it was not just leather, but it was like leather, you know, fetish kind of sex. And who doesn't have stuff? Like there you could meet people who had the same stuff you had. Many people would be probably drunk, which made them even easier to cause harm to. It's just scary even to think about it now.
This was before AIDS, but it still was a little scary for gay men to go out and pick people up. They had to kind of suss out based on some chit chat in a bar if the person they were dealing with was psycho. Add to that the fact that There was buzz about different bodies that had been popped up in the Hudson. Some of them were decapitated, dismembered, and died in a very grisly way. That added to the fright level.
On September 14th, 1977, a prominent reporter for Variety magazine named Addison Verrill was beaten and stabbed to death in his own apartment.
They went to a few bars, they were out late, they did a cocktail of drugs, and then they went back to Verrill's apartment where they had sex and did more drugs until the early hours of that morning. At first, the police thought that it was a robbery, and there wasn't much coverage of this murder at the time, but one Village Voice reporter, Arthur Bell, was one of the few, if not only, reporters reporting on these types of crimes. And he wrote about it and pointed out that it didn't look like a robbery because all of the valuable stuff in Verrill's apartment was still there.
As a gay person, the Village Voice was one of the ways that we would get any news at all, even if it was to, the personal ads part of the paper. I'm not sure they advertised gay bars, but certainly like maybe clubs and bands that catered to the gay community would be in there.
Arthur Bell was my predecessor at the Village Voice. I'm actually the person who replaced him after he passed. Arthur was a terrific gay activist, columnist. He wrote about showbiz, but he also wrote about more serious things like these murders. And it was a great move on the part of Arthur Bell to put in his column a plea for anyone who either did the murder or knew about it to reach him. And it actually did help lead to solving of the crime.
In the days after Verrill's slaying, police were looking for a suspect and wondered if it was tied to the so-called bag murders. But it was Arthur Bell and his tenacious journalism that gave authorities their biggest lead.
Shortly after he ran this article in the Village Voice where he was talking about the Addison Verrill murder, he got a call from an anonymous person claiming to have killed Addison Verrill. Bell talked to this person on the phone, and the person told him details of the crime. They told him that they didn't think that they were a psychopath, that they killed Verrill because they wanted some sort of relationship, that it was a crime of passion, essentially. Bell gets this call and he goes to the police, and the police confirmed that this was the actual killer because the person who talked to Bell had details that the police hadn't released. They give Bell a police detail, and he soon gets another call from somebody who had read his article that the killer was Paul Bateson. The police go to Paul Bateson's apartment where they find him drunk, and according to police documents that I obtained, when they got there, he indicated that he were there because of the Village Voice article. He gets taken into custody, and he gives the full same confession that he gave to Arthur Bell. That's where his arrest and everything begins, with this just wild story of him calling a reporter and confessing, and the reporter writing about the confession, and the reporter becomes part of the news, and the reporter is somehow involved, and it's just so wild. And it's read to me like it was a movie on its own.
After his arrest, Bateson allegedly confessed to the bag murders. However, no evidence ever proved his confession. Even during his trial in 1979 for the murder of Addison Verrill, the prosecutor said Bateson boasted to an acquaintance that he was responsible for the deaths of the other men. Bateson was sentenced to 20 years to life in 1979, but only for the murder of Verrill. He was released in August 2003. He passed away in 2012.
It was quite a shocking revelation. I think it's like many of us in professional relationships. We may work with people every day, but you don't really know their inner self, and especially if you don't socialize them, you don't know what their social life is like. Maybe I'm an incurious person that way because I don't usually go into that with someone unless they want to volunteer it. You do your job and then you go home and you have your life and they have theirs.
Filmmaker William Friedkin, who directed Bateson in The Exorcist, used the killer's story as the inspiration behind his controversial 1980 film, Cruising.
How'd you like to disappear?
Disappear?
Go undercover.
Cruising, which starred Al Pacino, is about a cop who goes undercover to solve serial killings within the gay community.
What he discovers will change his life forever.
Many in the LGBTQ community protested the film's production across New York City, including Village Voice journalist Arthur Bell, who wrote in 1979 that the movie is, quote, the most oppressive, ugly, bigoted look at homosexuality ever presented on screen. Bell also slammed Friedkin and told those reading his column to give the production hell. He added that if the filmmaker, quote, dealt with gay groups, he'd have an understanding of the insightful nature of his script. If he had any sense of social justice, perhaps he'd have altered his script, which, in effect, says that murder is a result of gay sex.
The movie did capture a certain scene, which was kind of the macho posturing and the leather fetishism of that anvil mineshaft scene. But I think what maybe the protests were partly responding to is the fact that we're not always victims, and Hollywood always shows gay people as victims. And yes, the murder cases that we're talking about turn out to prove that sometimes we are victims, but that's not the prevailing aspect of being a gay man.
Friedkin has claimed many times over the years that Bateson admitted to him that he was responsible for the bag murders. Yet, no proof of that claim exists. Bateson's story also appeared in Season 2 of Netflix's acclaimed series, Mindhunter, when detectives interviewed the Bateson character, played by actor Morgan Kelly, about the bag murders.
6 leather men dumped in the Hudson in garbage bags. Do you think that the person who killed those men could have been experimenting?
The bag murders remain unsolved to this day, and the bodies are still considered John Does by authorities.
By the end of the 1970s, the LGBTQ community demanded more protection by the city and authorities.
I never feel there's enough to protect this queer community. The cops, I know they always have to wait for evidence to solve a crime, but I often feel that when it's a gay person who's killed, they're not rushing to solve it. I also think the media took a long time to come around to the fact that we deserve equal coverage. It's a constant struggle. If you die of homophobia, you then are crucified again after your death by homophobia and the lack of attention to your death.
Do you feel that there was enough to protect the community at the time?
No. If there was, then the Anti-Violence Project wouldn't have had to exist.
Organizations like the New York Anti-Violence Project emerged to help bring attention to crimes against the LGBTQ community.
The Anti-Violence Project, or AVP, is an organization that works to address and end all forms of violence that impact the LGBTQ community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. And we started in 1980, and we started doing this work in response to violence that people in the community were experiencing that was really going without attention. And so folks came together on their own to do 2 things. One, to support the survivors, and that is still a very central part of our work today. And then the second thing that our founders did was they really came together to advocate for changes.
They would talk about how you never go off with someone without introducing them to your friend and talking about where, you know what I mean? So that if you were missing the next day, there was like sort of a buddy system so that you could track down what happened.
In the early 90s, New York's LGBTQ community faced a familiar terror. A serial killer was targeting gay men at specific piano bars.
Yes, they believe he very well may have more victims.
There were 4 gay men that were murdered at the very least. It was very scary. I mean, AIDS already was a terrifying plague that was affecting so many gay men. And now you had this man going to perfectly nice places like Five Oaks, which is a piano bar, Townhouse, which was at the time kind of a hustler bar. Half the people were sex workers, the other half were old men. But it was a lovely townhouse with flowers, and it almost looked like the waiting room to a funeral home, which actually proved prophetic in a very tragic way.
In 1991, sanitation workers collecting trash along the busy New Jersey Turnpike found the dismembered remains of 1 man across various trash cans, as well as other evidence like a blood-stained bedsheet, a saw, and bloody latex gloves. Cops say the victim's wallet was found in the trash. He was identified as 54-year-old investment banker Peter Anderson from Philadelphia, who was in Manhattan attending a political fundraiser. Reports say he had been separated from his wife for a year, with whom he had 2 children, after coming out as a gay man. He was last seen at the Townhouse Bar in Midtown.
When it opened in 1989, the New York bar scene was just starting to get wonderfully crazy, thumping and young and loud. And the Townhouse was none of those things. It was like a calculated throwback. Not only was it a piano bar, but it was a piano bar that just seemed really old, even on the day it opened. And that's who it attracted. It attracted older men and also attracted hustlers who were interested in older men, and vice versa.
More than a year later, in July 1992, the body of 57-year-old computer sales rep Thomas Mulcahy was also found in New Jersey Turnpike garbage cans, just like Peter Anderson. Mulcahy, a father of 4 from Massachusetts, was in New York City to give a presentation at the World Trade Center. Court documents, as well as police, say his wife said he was known to have affairs with men.
Mulcahy, a computer executive from Boston, was known to frequent gay bars in Manhattan.
Credit card transactions placed Mulcahy here at the Townhouse shortly before he disappeared.
People always said that's one of the reasons why the Townhouse was attractive to people, because if you were seen going into it, nobody would think twice.
In the spring of 1993, less than a year after Mulcahy's murder, 44-year-old Anthony Marrero, a sex worker who hustled in Manhattan, went missing. Days later, his body parts were found in a rural part of New Jersey in trash cans. Months later, in late July, body parts were found in trash cans picked up from a rest stop in Rockland County, New York. They belonged to Michael Sakara, a 56-year-old gay man who worked for the New York Law Journal. Sakara had been last seen alive leaving a bar in Greenwich Village with a man that he met there. The perp was dubbed the last call killer by the media because of his MO of picking up men as a bar was closing.
I remember the last call killer case. They blamed New York City for not getting involved. And it was very difficult for them to understand that none of the bodies recovered were recovered in New York City.
While the victims were all found in different locations outside Manhattan, investigators believe they were connected.
Cases that we do have are extremely similar. I mean, they're extremely similar in some of the earmarks of the crime.
Public outcry from the LGBTQ community demanded to know what was going on.
I remember the community being up in arms because the police department wasn't doing anything. And I remember taking it personal because none of the cases, although the men may have been last seen in Manhattan or parts of New York, none of the crime, at least we couldn't prove or have knowledge of, occurred within the city limits. So the community didn't understand we can't just go to another jurisdiction and take over the case. The second thing is, I was actually flattered to be asked to work the case. I'd like to think it wasn't only because I'm gay, but because they thought I was a fairly good detective.
What was it like working with all sorts of law enforcement teams and trying to catch the last call killer?
When we got involved, I think I went to New Jersey a couple of times, but basically the main hub, so to speak, was in New City, Rockland County, where the DA's office, the detectives there pretty much pulled everything together, which made sense because that was where the last body was found. I felt that we were welcomed.
After 1993, the killings ceased, but the families of some of the victims still had no answers as to what happened to their loved ones. In 2001, a break in the case came after New Jersey State Police sent fingerprint samples to the Toronto Police Department.
Once the task force in 1993 was over, a case like that goes to the bottom of the pile. This is not one of those situations where there's a team of detectives that are still working on it. The reason that they looked at it again is because Margaret Mulcahy, the wife of the second victim, was persistent and pushed them to do it. And also around that time, the Toronto Police Service was using a reasonably new technology called vacuum metal deposition. And because of relationships that the New Jersey police had with the Canadian police, they were aware of this technology and called in a favor.
The Toronto PD was using cutting-edge technology that lifted multiple matching prints. They linked them to a man named Richard Rogers.
Had they not done that, and then had the original fingerprint from Maine in 1973 been pristine, he still wouldn't have been caught.
Police found Rogers' fingerprints connected to another murder. In 1973, Rogers was tried for the murder of his roommate while he was a grad student in Maine.
He lived in a house with 3 other men, and one day, for reasons that weren't clear then and still are not clear, he took a roofing hammer and he beat one of his housemates to death. His name was Fred Spencer.
New Jersey detectives followed Richard Rogers' fingerprints to Maine to find that he had been tried and acquitted for the 1973 murder of a fellow student at the University of Maine.
It's a fluke that he got caught because a case could be made that the reason this case was solved is because whoever took Richard Rogers' fingerprint at the county jail in 1973 did a great job. If there had been any smudges on that print, if there had been too much ink or not enough ink, then the rest of it wouldn't have mattered. Richard Rogers was a pediatric nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital, and he had worked at the hospital since the late 1970s. He mainly worked with infants who had had cardiac surgery. And he was a gay man who lived in Staten Island, and he had his dark side. The reason his case is important is not just because ultimately the evidence from that case is what convicts Richard all those years later, but it's also important because the signs were all there in the way that he deliberately disposed of the body.
Investigators say Richard Rogers would coldly and efficiently chop up their body parts before dumping them along various highways and other places.
And of course, from my perspective, it's important because Fred Spencer deserved to be more than just an afterthought.
When Richard Rogers was caught, there was a vast sense of relief. The whole community kind of exhaled in unison. I know people that actually were not going out or trying to get picked up until he was caught.
In 2005, a New Jersey jury found Rogers guilty for the murders of Thomas Mulcahy and Anthony Marrero. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of hindering his own apprehension and was sentenced to 30 years to life on each murder charge, with additional 2.5 years for each hindering apprehension charge. He is currently in a New Jersey state prison serving a 65-year sentence. Elon Green profiled the victims in his acclaimed book, Last Call, a true story of love, lust, and murder in queer New York.
I just want readers to know about them as people beyond their obituaries. It's not as if these people were extraordinary any more than any of us are extraordinary. They were just trying to live their lives and live it as honestly as they could. And I want readers to understand the lengths that they went to do that. Richard being gay and the victims being queer, he was given more room to operate. I would say there was less scrutiny. You have a member of a neglected community killing other members of that neglected community. It's almost a free pass.
To this day, police still get grief for the length it took to capture Rogers, compounded with the crimes the LGBTQ community has faced and continues to face.
These men were really found brutally, not just killed, they were brutally killed. As much as I say you need to separate your emotions from your job, I can't think of any human being worth a hill of beans that wouldn't be upset after seeing and or reading about how these men were found. This guy was a sick so-and-so. So that alone should have the community know. Every cop I work with on that case, every single one wanted to get this son of a bitch in plain English.
The crimes of Richard Rogers, like that of Paul Bateson, are often not remembered like other high-profile crimes of their respective eras, and didn't garner that much media attention.
Why don't the atrocities that occur against people in the LGBTQ community get as much recognition as their straight cis counterparts?
I mean, one easy way to answer that is to say, of course, it's because of the existence of homophobia and transphobia in our society.
I think the only thing to take away from it is that the criminal justice system and the legal system have to be much better about dealing with whichever population happens to be most vulnerable at any given time. Whether that means Black people, queer people, or this day and age, probably trans people. And it's always shifting. There's always one group of people getting shafted. And I would hope that that would stop.
In the years after the Stonewall riots, some gay New Yorkers lived loud and proud, while others were still afraid to come out and be themselves as they feared stigma, ridicule, or exile. Havens across the city, like bars, nightclubs, or cafes, allowed gay New Yorkers to be their true selves. But violent homophobia against the LGBTQ community was also rampant.
So gay men on their way to the gay bars with like teenagers were beating them up. If you didn't know better, if you walked down certain streets, you were in danger.
When AVP was formed, it formed in response to hate violence, and particularly hate violence that gay men were experiencing coming to and from gay bars. The bars obviously were a clear target for the LGBT community. And so people started figuring out, sort of how to kind of create their own safety. Pairing up, our hotline was created at this time where people were just letting each other know, look, reach out if you've experienced any kind of violence. As they started to respond to hate violence and people started to call this hotline, they were hearing more and more also from folks who were talking about intimate partner violence.
That was one of the things that they really stressed to people was that in a bar, you decide to go home with a stranger, you're going to bring a stranger to your home, make sure you introduce him around. And if you're not there with a friend, to the bartender.
Before he leaves a bar with this man that he picks up there, he does something that the Gay and Lesbian Anti-Violence Project had been advising gay men to do, and that is to introduce this companion to others before you leave a bar with him. He introduces this man to his friends at the bar as a nurse, and that becomes a key clue.
Through public pressure, the NYPD began their community outreach.
The police department in the 70s is a lot different than how they evolved in the 80s, 90s, and present. In 1982, they came up with GOAL, Gay Officers Action League, and more gay cops, male and female, started to be a little more comfortable. We easily accepted? No, we weren't. But in time we were. When they started to see we had the same goals, we had the same ambitions, we're here to do a job. So if the community was looking at the police department like they did in the 70s, shame on them, because we've come a long way. To me, not only being a gay female, but just, I thought NYPD was the best job in the world.
Ultimately, the LGBTQ community had to advocate for itself in the face of harassment, homophobia, and the AIDS pandemic.
The AIDS epidemic was raging through the community, and the community was facing a government that was basically not paying attention, clearly did not care about what was happening. And so the community was getting together in a number of ways. Some people might remember ACT UP was in full force. People were actively protesting, holding die-ins, demanding that the government pay attention to what was happening with the community. So there was a lot going on. The community was vibrant, it was active. People were politically engaged and socially engaged.
The queer community, I believe, is so extraordinarily resilient. I mean, we have been not only through AIDS, which is not over, by the way, We go through homophobia and queerphobia on a daily basis. We constantly have to prove our right to exist and to have equal rights, even though we're consensual, responsible, tax-paying citizens, and there's always a fight. We've gotten stronger and stronger. We've learned to bond tighter and tighter. And if people outside aren't going to fight for us, we're going to have to fight for ourselves. And we've also come to appreciate the allies that help us through these horrible crises.